and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Often when we think about a murder mystery or a whodunit, the question is just that, whodunit? But in today's episode, we listen to a conversation between Philip Zelikow and the chair of our editorial board, Frank Gavin, about Zelikow's new book, The Road Less Traveled, The Secret Battle to End the Great War in 1916 to 1917. While the story of the peace talks is in itself fascinating, as are the potential consequences had they succeeded as they came so close, as Zelikow describes, what is equally fascinating is the question of why it is that this is a story that has not been previously told. It is a really interesting look into how history is shaped and how we understand the events of the past and how those understandings shape how we interpret events going forward. Let's listen in.
I could not be more excited to be here today with my good friend and colleague, Philip Zelikow, who has just published an absolutely outstanding book, The Road Less Traveled, The Secret Battle to End the Great War, 1916 and 1917. And I think the real challenge of this podcast, as it is with all of my conversations with Phil, is to keep it within an hour, to keep it on subject, because I think one of my favorite things in the world to do is get involved in deep, long conversations with Phil. He truly is a polymath and expert on so many different topics, but we're going to try to focus on this great book. So, Philip, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Frank. Good to be here with you. And good to be here with you, especially on this book, since you are, as I mentioned in my acknowledgments, you really encouraged me to stick with this argument and develop it. And that was important encouragement at an important stage in the project.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to diving into it. And maybe we could just start out with the basics. What is your argument? What are you trying to get across here? And maybe related, how did you come upon this project? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the development of your ideas.
I mean, first of all, I'm reluctant to plunge instantly into the argument because it then makes it sound like it's one of these argument books. And in fact, what I hope people will read the book for is one of the most extraordinary historical stories they are likely to encounter. It's a simply amazing story, and part of my job as a historian and author was not to ruin it, because the story is the characters are so interesting, what they aspire to do is so interesting. But now, what is a part of the story? People have an image of how the war widened in 1917. So the war is at end of 1916, beginning of 1917. The war is at its midway point. The two sides are stalemated. 1916 is the year of Verdun and the Somme. All those images of the trench stalemate that we carry in our heads. All the sides are exhausted. They're all actually, leaders in all the major powers are looking for a way to end the war, which itself is one of the revelations. That is, people have this image of the war in which you have these ossified, foolish leaders continuing in a foolish, stalemated war. The image in the British literature is sort of heroes led by donkeys. So part of the story begins with the fact that actually the leaders of the warring powers saw that the war was stalemated and wished to end it. German, British, French, and they all looked to the American president as the likely vehicle for ending it. Woodrow Wilson, all having in mind that 10 years earlier, an American president had ended the last great power war by mediating an end to the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Everyone knew that precedent. Midpoint of the war, exhaustion, seeking a way out. Americans carry in their head a story of how they entered World War I. That story, which every school child is supposed to learn, is that the Germans declared the U-boat war. Americans had drawn a line saying don't. The Germans declare it. We throw up our hands and decide to join the war against Germany. So the key reason we enter the war against Germany is the U-boat war. and maybe your high school class on this was enlivened by the additional color of, oh, and after the Americans broke relations with Germany, the British piled on by leaking the story of the famous Zimmermann telegram to further inflame American opinion, which is true. So, standard story, U-boat war, paren, plus Zimmermann telegram, close paren. My story is that the only reason for the U-boat war is because the peace talks had failed. The reason for the widening of the war is because the peace talks to end the war had failed. The U-boat business is just simply the corollary of that. That's just a fundamentally different story. The war widened because the peace talks failed. To which many of your listeners might say, what peace talks? We never heard of peace talks. So one question I could do, and I could do this in a room full of historians, by the way, is I could say, how many of you know that in August 1916, the German government asked Woodrow Wilson to mediate an end to the war? The German government made a secret peace officer, oh, and by the way, volunteered to compromise, offering up the restoration of Belgium just as a token of good faith, without the Americans even asking them to do it. This is not an informal peace feeler through intermediaries here and there on the margins. This is straight up, top of the German government to the top of the American government, blessed by the Kaiser. Indeed, the Kaiser, a couple of months later, wrote a letter personally to Wilson urging him on. So the question I could ask in this group is, how many of you know that the Germans made this effort to get Wilson to end the war in August 1916? In this room full of historians, I'll be surprised if more than 2 or 3 raise their hands. They don't even know this existed. Then among the 2 or 3, if I then said, oh, do you know what happened to that German peace offer? They don't. And they would not. That right there tells you something. Now, of course, the German effort to end the war and the German initiation of the talks with the Americans on how to do it was completely secret and completely covered up on the American and British side after the war. So it doesn't appear in the Anglo-American literature in any important way. Though the German evidence on this was available from the start, but all of that was swamped by all the attention and controversy about war guilt and the outbreak of the war in 1914, which has continued to rivet historical attention for generations. So top line is, your whole notion of why the war widened is fundamentally misconceived, and actually it's because of the failure of the peace talks. And then illustration, how many of you even know that the Germans initiated this peace effort with the Americans in August? Very few do, and you don't even know what happened to it. Then further question, how many, in this room full of historians, by the way, it could include historians of the First World War, how many of you know that the British government in the autumn of 1916 fully and out debated whether to bring the war to an end with Wilson's mediation, believing that they could not continue? That they had a fundamental debate about whether Britain and the Allies could continue the war. Also, autumn of 1916, how many of you know the British government had that debate? And again, I think a few hands would go up. A few especially especially specialist historians might even remember the names of 1 or 2 figures in that debate. And then if you ask them, well, how did that debate turn out? And what did they end up doing vis-a-vis Wilson? Again, just puzzled looks. That's an interesting question. Then you could then say, but of course, if I ask the American historians, have you ever heard of Woodrow Wilson's Peace Without Victory speech in January 19th? Yes. We've all heard of but they have no idea what relation it all had to these peace talks that have been going on at that point for 5 months. So back to the headline. Headline is, the fundamental image you have of why the war widened is misconceived because it's actually about the breakdown of peace talks that mostly you didn't even know happened, and that were not peripheral informal things, but were actually engaging the highest levels of government at the very center and deeply. and also the top of the French government as well. Now you start with that. So, okay, you've really rebooted my understanding of, if I accept your argument, you've really rebooted my understanding of why America got into the war. And I'll say, yes. And now think about this. If Wilson successfully negotiates an end to the war at the midpoint, think of how this changes world history. If the war ends at the end of 1916, and it more or less ends with everybody more or less going back to the pre-war borders with a Russian route through the Dardanelles, let's start thinking about the things that don't happen. There may or may not be a Russian revolution. But one thing every Russian historian would agree on, for sure, the Bolsheviks do not take power. Because there's no scenario in which the Bolsheviks succeed in October 1917 if the war hadn't been going on and Russia hadn't been vainly trying to continue to wage it. The whole series of revolutions and civil wars that convulsed Central and Eastern Europe and all of the Russian Empire, the revolutions and civil wars that convulse the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, all are replaced by something else. A huge portion of the toxins, and by the way, financial imbalances that will then poison the politics of the 1920s and lead to the crises of the 1930s, are now reset. So understanding this different top-line story about the war widened not only reinterprets why America got engaged in a European war for the first time in its history and changed American and world history forever in that way, understanding how World War I almost ended at the midway point fundamentally reshapes your notion of world history. And then the final coda is, and it was tantalizingly close to happening. The reasons it failed is not because the positions of the two sides were irreconcilable. It's not because the positions were far apart. In fact, the positions were reconcilable. It could have been done. It failed actually because some key people actually just did not quite know how to do it. There is an amazing story of confusion, dissembling. One person put it to me in a message yesterday, occasional treasonous conversations, narrow political ambition and duplicity, a fascinating and strange story that almost has to be read to be believed. In other words, not because of grand political differences, but because of this microscopic story that you have to turn up the historian's microscope even to see, turns out to then be a pivotal moment in world history.
It's a brilliant synthesis, and there's three big themes there. First is what happened, what didn't happen, and why. And that story, since I first heard you tell it, is just riveting and tragic, and missed opportunities, misunderstandings, bad intel and communications, bad timing, but particularly personalities, which I want to get to at some point. Then the second point of the extraordinary consequences of this history and what could have happened if that history had happened. But I have to ask, this is more of a specialist question, but it's what you led off to. Why historians miss this? I remember reading your paper, and it was as if I was hit by a 2x4. And as you said, it's not just the story itself, but it's the consequences. And I know that many, many historians have seen this. I love the part in the book where you were wrestling with how Arthur Link and John Milton Cooper and others wrestled with all this. So even if this is more for the historical community, I would love your thoughts and reflections on why we didn't know this story until you first told it.
I think the initial reaction to my argument among many people who know the literature will be incredulity. That is too big an argument. It can't possibly be true. If it was true, surely we would have known about it by now. And so that cannot be right. He's obviously done something wrong in it. I don't know if I'll bother to pick up the book to find out. So if you do pick up the book, you'll notice that there are a few very good historians, including John Milton Cooper, who found the story exceedingly interesting. But the incredulity factor is and so I've thought a lot about this myself. I'll just say at the outset, I think this book probably could have been written at any time in the last 40 years. And then it's almost idiosyncrasy that I happen to be the one who came across it. And I also mentioned that there are a couple of other very good scholars who actually, like right now, are also converging on pieces of this story too in complementary ways. There's an excellent English scholar named Dan Larson at Cambridge who is coming out with a book later this year called Plotting for Peace that focuses primarily on the British story. But the story Larson tells perfectly complements the story I tell on the British dimension, especially. On the German dimension, a terrific historian of the war named Holger Afflerbach, who probably knows this period in German history, the mid-war, better than anybody. Afflerbach actually published an outstanding book a couple of years ago in Germany in German called Auf Messerschneide that actually also saw this, but purely from the German angle. He saw the opportunity, the significance of the German move. But of course, that book is not really read by the Anglo-American audiences, although he's currently working on a translation. Now, but come back to why people miss it. First and fundamental thing is basically they didn't know anything had happened. The entire episode is occurring in secret on all sides. Historians notice, for instance, Wilson makes this odd peace note in mid-December 1916. And historians note that because that was made public and they kind of, that's interesting. And it kind of fizzled, but, I wonder what that relates to. And then he gives his Peace Without Victory speech 5 weeks later. And his course, that was a big speech. Everyone notices that. And there's lots of exegesis of the speech. But actually, they don't understand the context the wider context in which that's occurring. Because you see, the original German peace move was all in secret. Even though the Germans themselves ran their own investigation of why their peace move had failed right after the war ended, publishing an invaluable collection of testimonies and documents. This was run by the new Reichstag after the German Revolution. But the story never really worked its way into the Anglo-American literature. The key works of the 20s and 30s did not really digest that there had been a big peace move and big peace talks. It was not in the interest of the British and American victors to call attention to the fact that they had had a chance to end the war and had screwed it up for their reasons. So, absolutely critical source are Edward House's diaries. House, quite shrewdly, published a highly edited collection of his diaries with the prominent Yale historian, Charles Seymour. And that multi-volume edition of House's diaries is a standard reference source that historians rely on. House simply omits all the key entries in his diaries that don't fit his argument and thesis, all the German concessions and so on that we describe in the book, which are reported in his diaries, but he leaves them out of the published edition. So basically, you've got a situation where in House's lifetime, the unexpurgated diaries are not available. So the entire interwar period then frames the issues. The issues are diplomatically, big debate about 1914, big debate about the Peace of Versailles, puzzlement about whether or not Americans were right to make a big deal about submarine warfare. And that the debate focuses on, were we right to care about U-boat war? The whole peace talks understory completely missed. So that's the situation as you then get into the post-war era. You've already had your first generation of scholarship. You then get a vital second generation of scholarship by really just a handful of people who are beginning to penetrate some of this story. And they start getting closer, but don't quite get it. Here I'm really, above all, talking about Ernest May's work in 1959, The World War in American Isolation, the work of a Swedish historian named Carl Birnbaum at the same period, Swedish publisher, but published in English, and then Arthur Link's work for Wilson, and Link is doing some multi-archival research. They are only beginning to understand the stuff in the House diaries, which are only beginning to become available in their unexpurgated form, and which is an absolutely essential source for this. Only a few people are beginning to relate it to the German stuff. These three all read the German materials. May writes in 59, but because he's so focused on the U-boat angle, he kind of misses this. I'll come back to what May missed and what May thought about it. Birnbaum actually sees it. His book was titled Peace Moves and U-Boat Warfare, but Birnbaum is only looking at the German side. So he doesn't do the American and British sides of this at all. Link is kind of reading across the literatures and at first doesn't understand what he's seeing. And he keeps revising his interpretation of what happened as he keeps writing on this in the 60s and then in the late 70s. And finally, by the late 70s, it's dawning on Link that actually there was a huge peace opportunity that was lost. Link himself was never worked as a diplomat and does not fully understand the diplomacy. In a way, he never understands the problem any better than Wilson understood it. By the end of the 70s, Link is now writing, maybe there was a big peace chance. Wilson was betrayed. Wilson was betrayed by his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, above all. And then of course, Link also came to despise House, and so he blames House a little bit. But Link himself, and he's piecing this together at that level in stuff that's not very widely read at the end of the 70s. His main volume in the Wilson biography had come out in the mid-60s. Now, none of these people, in turn, are able to take in the British evidence. The British evidence is really the last good evidence to come out. The group of American scholars are beginning to use the House material. A few of them look at the German stuff, though they're not keyed into the Peace Moves issue because it hadn't been spotlighted before. And then the British evidence begins coming out in the 70s and 80s. British evidence consists of things like the tremendous diaries of the British National Security Advisor, not the term they used back then, Maurice Hankey, which are a remarkable resource. Or things like the diaries of David Lloyd George's mistress, which turn out to have some good evidence. And also a couple of obscure sources, but that have gold nuggets of information in them, with notes of certain key cabinet meetings and other things taken by quite obscure cabinet ministers like Lewis Harcourt and Lord Crawford. But if you begin assembling all of this and then get into the British archives, let me give you a concrete illustration of what I mean. The French president, Raymond Poincaré, a famous nationalist, a key figure in the 1914 decisions for war, the living personification of the French Union Sacrée, sacred union, in which we heal our political divisions to wage the war. So, conservative nationalist French president Poincaré, 1916. August 1916, the same month that the German chancellor is pleading secretly with the Americans to mediate peace and offering compromise. In fact, practically the same week, Poincaré has a secret meeting with Britain's king, King George V, one-on-one. No one else in the room. Poincaré confides to the king. In fact, I can't tell this to anybody else, but we need to end the war now as soon as possible. The French public does not understand how bad things are. We see that Russia is tottering and may have to leave the war soon. We think the opportunity to end the war will come later this year. It will probably come through Woodrow Wilson's mediation. And when Wilson comes out with his terms, we really need to sit down and look at them and try to find a way out. That's Raymond Poincaré to the King of Great Britain and the British Empire. The episode I've just described, which is sensational, none of this appears in no biography of Raymond Poincaré, including the French biography by François Roth. Where we found it's in the British archives, because what happened is the king goes back to London and he then debriefs this meeting to the British ambassador to France, who, though he tries to tamp down the information, eventually he's forced to disclose all of this to the British War Cabinet at the end of August 1916. And so, but the only way you'd find out the unexpurgated version of what Poincaré told the king is in that ambassador's diary, which is in the British archives. That ambassador, by the way, published his diaries in the 1920s, leaving all of this out. So, but if you can find his handwritten originals in the British archives, and this is an illustration of why the British archives help too. Is you find out the whole depth of the British and French debates, how closely they were considering a negotiated peace. Finally, also you get in the 70s and 80s the realization that Britain was going bankrupt in the dollars to continue the war. So that actually the Allied side, which on the surface could continue the war if it wanted to, actually could not. They were going to have to curb the war effort by the spring of 1917 anyway, because of this imminent bankruptcy. This is the greatest secret of the war on the Allied side, and it does not really begin to fully get understood until the 1970s and 1980s through the work of a variety of people. The unpublished manuscript of the authorized historian of the J.P. Morgan Company, a man named Vincent Caruso. Kathleen Burke was beginning to see some of this and the work she was doing in the early 80s. I comment in the book that John Milton Cooper, Wilson's famous biographer and a terrific historian of this period, Cooper actually could have seen this story because Cooper was one of the first people to see the British bankruptcy coming. He wrote a terrific article in 1973 that comments like, oh my God, the British are going to have to leave the war in 1917. The whole situation is falling to pieces, as he's piecing together stuff in the American and British archives too. But Cooper simply didn't turn his full attention to trying to write the story of the peace talks. But if you pull all of these things together, and by the way, my pulling them together in this way is not an artifact of hindsight. The most informed insiders at the time saw many of the factors that I'm describing to you at the time. And they understood that they were involved in highly secret peace talks that have been in mediation efforts going on for months. And one reason the British understood this so well is that we now know British intelligence was intercepting the secret German communications to and from America. And so Bettman's original move in August 1916 was intercepted and decrypted by British intelligence, and the British government was aware of the secret German-American mediation, which comes up, therefore, in the British cabinet discussions. It's a long answer to your question, like basically, why didn't we know this before? But to do that, I really needed to unpack a little bit of how the historiography of the war had developed, why different evidence came out at different times, and why really the full ability to see all of this has only surfaced in the last 40 or so years.
This is such a great lesson for younger historians and the general public, that we sort of assume that there's this kind of received wisdom that's passed down, and these questions are their answers are taken for granted, and then you sort of chip away at it a little as you did, and you start seeing that the architecture holding up that conventional wisdom, that there's much more underneath it, and which is just absolutely fascinating. And it leads me to another question, somewhat of method.
Well, by the way, if I can come back, there's a key coda I forgot to mention. It's very important and concerns our old friend Ernest May, because Ernest May was part of the rediscovery. Remember I mentioned that he had written that landmark early account of the end of neutrality? He was like one of the handful of key early scholars in the second generation of historiography, which is still, for these issues, is the last big generation. May is the person who helped me find the story. May and I were working on a world history project in the 2000s, in the mid-2000s. And in the course of that project, we somehow stumbled across the German material about the peace move. And then where we were reading some British stuff about some of these debates in the fall of 1916 that was being published by some British historians. And we began asking ourselves, like, kind of what the devil did happen with this German peace move? Because it looks like the situation actually was really ripe for this. And we had some conversations about this, and we began quickly digging deeper, and quickly came to the conclusion, and Ernest and I talked about this, like, oh my God, this thing deserves a really new look, and a really hard look. That's in a way, that's where we left the situation in the late 2000s, just before Ernest's death. And it's kind of that little sort of bone in my teeth that I've been sort of preoccupied with off and on amid other projects for more than 10 years now. In a way, it was Ernest, who was one of the founding scholars of this historiography, who actually, and this is of course very much to his credit, actually helped see the need to revisit these issues again.
Well, one of the great things about the book, and it reminds me so much of Ernest and his best work, is when I first saw the initial parts of this project, it was very focused on Wilson and the U.S. decision-making. And as you dug deeper, it became this international history. Suddenly, one minute you're in New York or Washington, the next you're in Berlin, then you're sort of at the Western Front with King George, and then you're in London. And I wonder if you could talk, you pulled that together so seamlessly. I wonder if you could talk about, particularly, I think the last podcast that I did, Four Horns, was with Fred Logevall and Danny Bessner on their Problems with International History piece. And this strikes me in many ways. I just love how you go from capital to capital, and it almost heightens the tragic element of it because you as the historian know what each party knows. You know what they're doing. You know what they want. You can see the tragedy of the misunderstanding, miscommunications, the occasional malfeasance by certain actors. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that process where you started with the story that seemed very much focused on Wilson in the summer and fall of 1916, and then expanded into this just really complex but interwoven global history.
It's absolutely right. And we started basically with the German peace move, the fact that there were British debates that make it clear that peace was possible, and then begin reading the House diaries. What then happened, though, is you start actually deeply looking at the evidence on all three sides and then start lining it up against each other in real time. And then you begin, wait, House is saying he said this, or Wilson says this to House, but then House says this to the German ambassador. So if you're just looking at the German ambassador's report about what House said Wilson said, you have one version of Wilson. If you look at House's diary, you get just the opposite version of Wilson. So then, wait, House is lying to the German ambassador. He's actually, according to himself, and according to his account in his own diary, he's exactly flipped the situation. So anyone looking at the German evidence will be misled. And if you look at House's diary, it seems to make internal sense until you then put the two things side by side. You begin doing that also with the British evidence. So one of the fascinating sources in this story, the British send a young intelligence agent to Washington, a fascinating figure named William Wiseman, who becomes fast friends with House. And basically, Wiseman starts running House as a British intelligence agent, unpaid. It's kind of, you have to sort of read the story to fully see it. And House is telling Wiseman a lot of this stuff. And you actually then have to read Wiseman's reports back to C, which is the code name for the head of British intelligence, very connected to the Foreign Office. But then if you read Wiseman's intelligence reports about, which are in, by the way, you can read them at Yale, most of them. Wiseman kept them. You could do that back then. And actually Wiseman often will annotate in pencil he uses lots of code letters in the originals, and he annotates in his hand what these code letters stood for. So Wiseman's sending his intelligence reports back to London, but you can then compare that with House's diary and his account of the same conversations. And all the other, and you begin triangulating all this, and the story just starts to blow you away. And then you begin working in the financial side, you see, and you begin lining the timelines up. And see, then, of course, as soon as this financial stuff is really important, and they had a key discussion. Oh, wait, that must connect to their discussion of this other thing later in the day. And it's as if this puzzle pieces all start coming together, and you can start putting in the last pieces in which the whole picture now begins to make sense.
So one of the great things, any great history is like reading a great novel, and you develop certain feelings towards some of the main characters. And I want to, they play such key roles. And you highlight some important minor characters, but there's some major ones I want to ask you about. And I want to, tell you my reaction. Of course, there's Bettman Hollweg, Chancellor, and you feel pity, right? And there's this sense of
maybe some admiration.
Admiration, really up against it. But Wilson, and I want to spend a special amount of time on Wilson because obviously so much has been written. One is left being puzzled, House, frustrated. But then David Lloyd George, who just furious, right? And this is always my reaction when I read this as obviously a brilliant political tactician. And you have this bit at the end, which I love, about the Lloyd George defenders. Don't go comparing him to Churchill. So I wonder, and you can pick any of the four and how you want to, because these individuals, these are the four that seem really to loom so large in the story. And they have such complex motivations. They've obviously been studied quite a bit. And maybe we can start with Lloyd George, his motivations, the change of government in December, the timing, the sort of the debate that took place that you so nicely chronicle in the fall about the British situation, and help us understand what Lloyd George was up to.
Well, let me slightly flip the order of the.
Okay, sure.
But I will end with Wilson to segue to more on Wilson. Let's start with the German Chancellor, Bettmann Hollweg. There was a lovely long blog post about Bettmann Hollweg and the 1914 controversies written by Tom Otte. O-T-T-E is a terrific piece in H. German. And you're kind of like, Bettmann Hollweg is slipping into the mists of time. He's this obscure, misty figure. Students of the 1914 crisis mostly roll their eyes about him as someone who botched, maybe fatally negligently, some certain key episodes in the July 1914 crisis. He's a colorless figure in the July crisis who may have handled it negligently. And then there's a school of German historiography that says, oh, you think Bettmann was the good German, the centrist German. In fact, he was as bad as the rest of them, led by Fritz Fischer and Fischer's acolytes. And they overwhelmingly focus on 1914 and some things in 1914. And I have a little footnote discussing that scholarship. But that's the Bettmann Hollweg of 1914. His son dies in the war later that year. As I point out in the introduction, Bettmann is tormented by guilt about the outbreak of the war. As he says at one point to a journalist friend of his, who noted this in his diary, we all have our share of guilt for this war. To say that this is on my mind says too little. The thought never leaves me. I live in it every day. That's the Bettmann Hollweg of 1915. And then comes the issue that's the framing issue for Bettmann Hollweg during the war, is the U-boat war in America. And Bettmann becomes the stalwart seawall, resisting wave after wave of pressure to try to end the war with the U-boat panacea. And he holds off the U-boat advocates steadily for like a year and a half. He's shrewd, he's determined, and he is powerful. He rallies the center and holds a lot of the left, which controls 2/3 of the German Reichstag. The conservatives hate him and are baying for his blood. But Bettmann is powerful enough to see off the powerful, charismatic head of the German Navy, the famous Alfred von Tirpitz. He sees off Tirpitz. All right, now he's opposed by the powerful head of the German army, Erich von Falkenhayn. He sees off von Falkenhayn too. He devises in the summer of 1916 the way out. The way out, the way to avoid a widened war, the way out is a compromise peace. It's time to do it. Time to end the war. The peace talks should begin. And he, Bettmann designs this. He brings the Kaiser along at the end of July 1916. Not only that, he leads the effort in the fall of 1916 to coordinate the peace move with all the major political factions in the German government, readying them all for a compromised peace, conditioning them to it. Here are the concessions we'll have to make. We're going to do it. The narrative is self-defense. Germany's been surrounded by her enemies. If she survives and defends herself, it will have been a triumph. Everybody is grudgingly or less grudgingly going along with that narrative. Bettmann coordinates the move with the Allies. He coordinates it with the Austrians, with the Ottoman Empire, all in secret, all orchestrated. This is what, and that's Bettmann, right? And he's this figure lost to history. And those historians who know about them have this sort of derogatory image. Yet he is this extraordinary figure the more you get to know him, and he leaves very few records behind. All his papers were destroyed in the Second World War, so you mostly have fragmentary stuff written by others around him. But from those fragments, you can see the picture. And it's just kind of worth recalling him before we turn now to the more colorful people who are much, much better known, like David Lloyd George, for example, who your reaction to. Sometimes when I was finishing this book, I sometimes thought they're going to need to post a guard around his crypt in Westminster Abbey if for people who read this book. Because there are some people in Britain who are going to read this book and want to visit that crypt. Because he's a central figure on the British side. And he's very gifted. But he uses his gifts in ways that I think will appall many readers at a number of different stages. He is at one level both the architect of the move to peace in Britain and also its demolisher. He is in private, the person who more than anyone else is eloquently denouncing Britain's position in the war and the need to bring it to some sort of conclusion. Yet at the same time publicly setting himself up as the person who says Britain can fight forever. And that's why you should make me prime minister, is because I will lead the forever fight, the fight to the finish, and so on. And he is the person who in the final cabinet, in these ultimate cabinet meetings about whether to continue in the war, basically sets up the debate. Yes, we ought to have this debate, and then begins making the political moves to undermine it and make himself prime minister. And then after becoming prime minister, is basically readying the peace parachute because he knows he's going to run out of money and his military schemes to try to bring the war to an end could founder, which they do in weeks. And so he's readying the peace parachute, but it's going to be on his time and in his way. So there's Lloyd George, this fascinating, central, infuriating, and fateful character. Funny thing is for British readers, the readers will find it difficult to find an easy political alignment because they're actually really admirable conservatives and really admirable Liberal Party leaders in this story who actually see what needs to be done and are moving to do it. The admirable figures is one of the things that will pull you through in this account. There are so many figures who see what needs to be done and almost get there, but there's Lloyd George. Now, Wilson. At last. Now, and Wilson, the portrait of Wilson, at the top level, you can say is damning. In the epilogue, I say that this was the most consequential diplomatic failure in the history of the United States. And Woodrow Wilson is the person principally responsible. He is the accountable figure. So you could say, Zelikow is setting this up as another anti-Wilson polemic, another, cartoonish figure of Wilson, the woolly-headed idealist. But in fact, the portrait that the reader will take away from Wilson is actually in many ways quite positive. At the level of grand strategic thinking and the overall view of the war, in many ways, Wilson is profoundly insightful and perceptive. In many ways, actually, which is exactly contrary to his image among scholars and many people. He's extremely pragmatic and realistic. He's not interested in adjudicating the morality of who was right and who was wrong in the outbreak of the war. He's not interested in figuring out who's right or wrong versus allies versus central powers. His view is that you need a peace without victory, a compromise peace, because if either side wins decisively, that will simply create such bitterness and poison the environment so much that it will make a peace impossible, an enduring peace. Of course, he's exactly right in that prediction, and then ends up like a figure in a Greek tragedy, having to actually live out the truth of his own prophecy in 1919 and beyond. So here's Wilson, who at a large level beautifully sees what needs to be done, knows that he is the person who needs to play the key role to do it, gets that. He gets the urgency of this more than anyone else in the American government. More, he is the person who brilliantly orchestrates the financial move that essentially cuts off the flow of continued loans to the British and makes it clear the war is going to have to be brought to an end. He does this completely in secret. Edward House does not even know Wilson has done this. So there's all that, and then yet, you have the Wilson who knows what needs to be done and does not know how to do it. Simply does not have the operational craft to do it. And there's a deep lesson here, actually, including maybe for one or two scholars, which is you can be brilliant in diagnosing a problem, yet incompetent in knowing how to solve it. And Wilson, in this case, his incompetence is quite specific. He's actually competent at many things, but his competence in this meshes with certain peculiarities in his character: the aloofness, the solitariness, the sense that he's surrounded by mediocrities, which he is, though that's largely his fault, and therefore takes on him too much on himself, and then does not have the competence himself to do a lot of the things he wants to do, and does not, in some respects, does not know it. He ends up at a critical stage, as you'll remember, since he's getting no help at all, like not one page of constructive help from his government, though he has diplomats overseas who are very good. Not the ambassadors, but junior diplomats. He starts getting key advice, actually, just by reading the editorial pages of the New Republic. He's getting advice literally practically week to week in what he should do in a critical phase of the crisis. And actually, the editorial writers of the New Republic are not bad. They're actually better than anyone working in the American government, but they didn't know that they were actually in the position of effectively giving operational advice for the most cataclysmic problem in the world to the American president, that he was taking their editorials, all too literally.
As you know, asking a historian about Wilson's like a Rorschach test for how they feel about so many things, right? It's very hard for anyone to put aside their priors and their assumptions. And having gone through your work a few times and being around a lot of people who have strong feelings with Wilson and trying to find a level to look at it with fresh eyes, I came away from your account very much exactly as you said, that Wilson had this almost extraordinary instinct on the grand strategic level about what needed to be done. I mean, I think your point about the financial diplomacy is absolutely critical. A sense for, in an ideal world, how things should turn out that would best advance American interests. He even handles, for these people who don't think that he's a pragmatist, he handles, this is a man who got more domestic legislation through as a minority president than just about anybody, handles a defense reauthorization bill. He looks quite skillful in handling a very tight election. On the other hand, as you say, almost no operational follow-through. And so the question I had was, because compared to, you nicely laid out how skilled Bettman Holdwig was at this, you lay out in amazing detail how sophisticated the British state operation is, intelligence, foreign affairs. And I kept wondering how much of this was just an element of, this is really America's first big appearance on the stage. You obviously mentioned TR and his work a decade earlier. And you just see a set of institutions, there's no intelligence capability. There's very little in the way of preparing briefing books. There's just Wilson with these occasional conversations with House, and House is his own character. And you keep thinking to yourself, well, was it a question of that the United States just didn't have yet the institutional apparatus because of where it was in the world? Or was it that, Wilson, he was on a second Secretary of State who seemed completely out of line with his basic worldview. And just he was your classic professor who thought he could do it himself and he didn't really need the staff work. How should we understand this brilliance at a macro level and this unbelievable failure at a micro level? And I'm thinking here, you might all, because when I read the first version of this, it had seemed things were dead by December. The great thing about the book is there's this rebirth in January and February where things, even after Lloyd George, even as Bettman Holdings holding everyone back, but at that final failure really does seem to be on the American government side in so many ways. Help us understand why Wilson failed. Is it his personality? Is it the government? Is it the institutions? How should we understand that story?
Both are true. That is, first, are the institutions immature? Yes. Is it amateur hour? Yes. There is no, America has still not created a foreign service. The foreign service is not created until the 1920s. The War and Navy Department have little input into this except a broad intelligence reading of the situation in the war, which is actually more or less accurate. The American military attaches read the war situation pretty well during the war, and their assessment that right now the war looks like a draw was about right. They may have overestimated the Allied position a little bit, and they paid no attention to finance. But Wilson was dimly but sufficiently aware of the Allied financial predicament, which no one else in his government really fully understood. Few bankers on Wall Street understood it. Wilson, though, understood it and said so and acted on it. Now, no one is doing any staff. Wilson wants to make the peace move to end the war. He's been planning, really, for instance, all through the autumn of 1916, so literally his first day in the office after he's reelected. He'd been waiting, hence like a coiled spring, for the moment he was reelected to make his peace move. Clears his desk, going to work on nothing else, tells House to come from New York down to Washington to get to work. Knowing this for those months, that he's about to, this is the supreme task of his life. No one in the American government has even thought to prepare so much as one page of analysis as to how Wilson might do this. Not one page. Now, and I have spent some time actually outlining as a former diplomat, even knowing what you knew at the time and knowing from the experience of what TR did, what you could do. Now, given that it's amateur hour and the institutions are fundamentally quite weak, the way previous presidents who were good at this have offset these weaknesses is interesting. So you've read some of the work I've done on, for instance, William McKinley. Bob Zoellick and others have done some good work on the TR diplomacy and the Russo-Japanese crisis. So what you find then is, it's amateur hour. These individuals start picking out and identifying key people, and they effectively improvise a team of smart people to lean on and have good judgment, whether it's people like a John Hay over here, or William Howard Taft, or Elihu Root. Well, Wilson's case, he has actually a couple of very good junior diplomats, one in London, though he's slow to recognize him, a man named William Hepburn Buckler, and then the young diplomat Joseph Grew in Berlin. These are not ambassadors. They're very talented, though, and actually Wilson has a very good understanding of the situation in Germany. It's London he doesn't understand. Buckler, by the way, is trying to tell him about it, and Wilson doesn't really quite take it in. And he ends up relying for his advice on what to do on the supreme dilettantish amateur Edward House. Now, so the first part of it is your institutional foundation then quite weak. But then comes the personal dimension. This is not William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt improvising the brilliant team and doing a lot of personal work with it. This is now Wilson who's trying to do it himself and is relying on faithfully on Edward House. House, by the way, who is not a policy advisor on many other subjects of very great importance, but for various reasons, he is a very important advisor on patronage issues of all kinds and on this particular issue of the war. And House is not only of no value, House actually makes things much worse because he actively manipulates and dissembles in various ways that end up causing really quite serious problems, fateful problems in Germany. And the reports that Bernstorff has to truthfully send back about the lies House is telling him. Of course, Bernstorff doesn't know these are lies. So, but meanwhile, the irony is that if you read the latter part of the book, a good advice is pouring into Wilson about what to do. He's getting advice. Well, the German ambassador is basically practically spelling out, here's how you should do this, A, B, C. If that's not enough, the British intelligence agent Wiseman is even kind of, well, okay, here's actually how you can do this. And Wiseman, who's like 30 years old, captain in the British Army, now working as an intelligence agent, and Wiseman spell. And then Herbert Hoover comes back from working on humanitarian relief. And as soon as House asks him, well, I don't know, how do we do this? Hoover, like in 5 minutes, said, okay, well, you would do it, and he spells it out. Wilson is getting letters from liberal British parliamentarians writing him that are also in their letters kind of sort of spelling out exactly how it should be done. And he's not quite assembling it and putting it together, partly because he'd gotten fixed on one or another idea of how to do it. And then once he fixes on these ideas, his mind kind of closes on them. So you start with the basic institutional weakness, but then you have a situation which it becomes a lot on Wilson, because Wilson is improvising in a way that fits his very peculiar talents and weaknesses that are very individual to him, in an environment where actually quite a lot of very good advice was actually available to him if he had properly harnessed it and recognized it. It just certainly didn't come to him from his principal advisor, one of the two people in the world he'll talk to about this.
No, and that's, if we had more time, the other person I wanted to strangle reading your book is House. But the final question I wanted to ask you, and I could ask tons more, it's just such an important book, but you begin the book with a really heartbreaking vignette between two poets, Robert Frost and Edward Thomas, and to highlight literally and in literature the consequences of paths not taken. And I wonder if you could tell that story, but I wonder if you could also help us reflect upon one of the big elements that one is left with in this book are the extraordinary consequences of actions not taken, the sort of how to think about counterfactual history. The thing that I find so moving and engaging about your book is the same thing that I find so, I don't know if horrifying is the right word, but if this war had ended, which it very plausibly could have by the end of 1916, early 1917, we would live in a much different world. Now, obviously, we can't know exactly what that world would be like, but we can certainly imagine in the immediate aftermath, far less violence, far less tragedy. And I wonder both just your reflections on that from a narrow methodological point of view, how to think about it, but from a kind of a larger sort of lessons, insights into the world, because that is the thing one is left with. For all of our obsession over the July crisis of 1914 and, a driver making a left instead of a right and a telegram coming here and not going there, or a partial versus a full mobilization, in many ways, this is, as you point out, so much more poignant because it unfolds over a longer bit of time. People know what's at stake. They are trying and they're reaching out, and yet it doesn't happen. And I would love your reflections, maybe by starting with that vignette and then talking about how you came to think about the consequences of choices and paths not taken.
Well, if I may do one of the rare successful unions of the humanities and political science, poetry and political science, you can say that Robert Frost's famous poem, The Road Not Taken, is the supreme literary meditation on counterfactual analysis. It turns out that if you then dig into when and why did Robert Frost pen that poem, he writes that poem in 1915 about the dilemma of his friend Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas, in the middle of World War I, Robert Frost's very close friend in England. Thomas is deciding whether or not to go to war or go to America. He's going to enlist in the forces or he's going to go to America. And he's debating between these choices. And his dithering, from a little bit from Frost's point of view, inspires Frost to write this poem. Thomas is quite hurt by the poem. And I quote some of the correspondence between the two men. And Thomas decides to enlist. And he does not take the road to America in peace. That is his road not taken. And indeed, as the reader will discover, in Thomas's case, to borrow from the poem, that has made all the difference. And that is a jumping off point because, of course, the road not taken in this war was the road to America and peace. It was the road less traveled in this case. So it's absolutely appropriate all the way down to use Frost's poem as a metaphor for this particular story. The story itself has two enduring dimensions. One is, just as you alluded to, Frank, in your very good question, is the immensity of the world historical consequences of the failure to peace. Once you understand how close things were and that the positions were reconcilable, and I developed this point some in the book, then the staggering historical significance of this comes into view. So that's immense. And as you were also right to say, we've devoted entire libraries to the 1914 outbreak. And mine is the first book devoted to this failed peace effort. And it deserves a lot more attention, and I hope we'll get some. Because in this, that was not a hurried 4 weeks. This is stretching over 5 months, but it's being engaged in secret, and it hadn't been, so we're calling our attention to this because of these immense consequences. If the war ends at the midway point, all the consequences of World War I do not fully ensue. It would still have been the worst war so far in human history. But things that happened, as Robert Gerwarth in his important book has pointed out, the things that happened after the end of 1916 is what really then pushes a lot of Europe and the Middle East off the precipice. And that's Gerwarth's recognition of that point is widely shared by other historians. The sense of 1617 as a key midway point, turning point in the war. Now, so one dimension of that is to see the immensity. Then the final point, which you were alluding to, is how do we think about this methodologically? Aside from the fact that it's important to consider things that don't happen, to do proper analysis. I mean, my whole book is devoted to a peace that did not happen, peace moves that did not bear fruit, public fruit. But if we don't understand what did not happen, then how do we learn? Because then you learn nothing about choice. History is nothing if it is not the history of human choices. And it's impossible to understand any choice if you don't understand the road not taken as well as the road that was. And in this case, the secret to understanding the choice requires the use of what I call, as you know, the historian's microscope. It is very common for scholars, and especially social scientists, to rely on macro analysis, what I would use following the medical analogy, the study of gross anatomy, which is actually the way we understood all sickness until, about 200 years ago. Since we're all right now fixed on the course of a virus, a microorganism, the COVID-19 virus, it's worth recalling that we had never seen a virus or knew what one was before about 1930. Then we said, how important is it to use a microscope if we want to understand the cause of the pandemic that is convulsing the world and changing the course of world history? Both the cause and the cure for this virus is aided vitally by microscopes, by the understanding of molecular biology. The same is true for history and great events. In this case, as an illustration, to understand the fateful choices that convulsed this world of more than 100 years ago, you need to use the historian's version of the microscope. You need to pull all the different factors together on your slide, and you need to examine a lot of things close up. And then when you do, you unpack a whole level of existence, whole layers of life that are enormously fascinating and rich to study. And so the reward here, I think, for those who will actually follow this path are very great.
Well, Philip, that is a wonderful, also haunting way to end what's been a tremendous discussion. I can't recommend this book highly enough. The Road Less Traveled, The Secret Battle to End the Great War of 1916 to 1917, which is out and available now, and you should just go out and get a copy. It's absolutely tremendous. And thank you, Philip, for joining us today for just a terrific conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.